Hey y'all, welcome back to another holiday video. So in this one, we're going to be making a caramel cake. And let me start off by saying that low key, this recipe was a fail. High key, it still tasted good. So you can take that how you want to take it, but it still turned out really good. We're still eating it, but it's just not the prettiest cake you've ever seen. So I'm going to show you guys how I made it and what I think you can do differently so you can avoid some of the mistakes that I made while making this cake. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So of course I'm going to start off with making the actual cake, and this is just kind of like a buttermilk cake, I guess you would call it. And the recipe was super easy. I got this recipe on Pinterest and I will link it below so you guys can check it out. So it starts with 2 sticks of butter, so 1 cup of butter. And then I just started to beat that until it got a little bit light and fluffy. And then I added in 2 cups of sugar. And then I creamed the butter and sugar together for a couple minutes until it was light, fluffy, the same way I showed you guys how to do it in the pound cake recipe. And then the recipe calls for 4 eggs. So I added those in one at a time, beating in between each addition. The next step is to alternate between buttermilk and flour. So you're going to do 1 total cup of buttermilk and 3 cups of flour. Because I didn't have buttermilk, I took some regular milk and added a little bit of apple cider vinegar to it, maybe about a teaspoon to a teaspoon and a half, and just allowed the vinegar to curdle the milk. And that's what you can do as a hack if you don't have buttermilk on hand. The recipe actually called for using self-rising flour, but because I didn't have that, I added in 1 teaspoon of baking powder for every cup of flour, and then I also added in a half teaspoon of salt. Once everything was well combined and those ribbons started to form, then I went ahead and added some vanilla and beat that in. And then I separated the batter into 3 9-inch baking pans, taking care to try to make sure that they were all pretty even as far as the layers go, because you don't want one layer to be a 1/2 inch thick and the next one to be a 1/4 inch thick. So I kind of spooned the batter into each cake pan one at a time so that I could divide it pretty evenly. So I went ahead and baked that at 350 for about 20 to 25 minutes. And then once I took it out of the oven, I put some aluminum foil on top after a few minutes, and that allowed the cakes to stay moist and kind of sweat a little bit. And then it was on to making the actual caramel frosting. And this is where it got hairy. This is definitely where things kind of went awry. And I'm not sure if it's because I didn't have buttermilk for the frosting and I did that buttermilk hack again, but we can get into it. Let me just show you guys what I did. The ingredients for the caramel are 4 cups of sugar, 2 sticks of butter or 1 cup, 1 cup of Crisco or vegetable shortening, and then 2 cups of buttermilk, and 2 teaspoons of baking soda. So I threw everything into the pan on medium heat and I started to cook it, stirring it with a wooden spoon. And what I noticed was the sugar will stick to the bottom of the pan, but don't worry about that because it does cook down and it all combines seamlessly in the end, so it didn't create any issues when I had those large sugar crystals. I just continued to cook it and it all evened out. So once I was cooking it, that baking soda really caused a reaction and it made it kind of bubble up. So I ended up having to go to a larger pot because I didn't want it to boil over. And the directions specifically state that you want to mix all the ingredients in a 3 to 4 quart cast iron Dutch oven. You want to swirl the pan to keep the ingredients moving. And then you want to cook the caramel to the softball stage, which is 235 to 245 degrees on a candy thermometer. It also said that if you didn't have a candy thermometer, you could do a cold water method where you drop some of the caramel into cold water. And I'm assuming that that means it's supposed to harden inside the water and become actual caramel. I never got to that point, even though I cooked it until it was the same color as the caramel that's on the picture. So I don't know what I did wrong. I don't know if it was the actual not having the buttermilk that caused it not to set up right. I also added a little bit of salt in there, so I don't know if the salt stopped it from forming. I'm really not sure exactly what I did, but let me know in the comments what you think caused it not to work right. But anyway, let's keep on going. So I just kept cooking it until I felt like it was done. I didn't want it to get too dark or have a burnt flavor, so I went ahead and took it out. And then the last step is to remove it from the heat and beat it with a wooden spoon until creamy and ready to spread. Now, this was super hot, so it would have taken probably an hour to beat this until it was thick and creamy. And maybe that's because mine didn't set up properly, but I wasn't about to do that. So I went ahead and pulled out my hand mixer and started to beat it with that on the lowest setting. And it took me about 15 to 20 minutes to get it to a thick consistency doing it that way. But I noticed within the first 5 minutes that it was working, so I was happy about that. So after I got it to a point where it was thick enough, I went ahead and transferred it into a bowl and just kept mixing it and mixing it and mixing it and letting it thicken up even more. So what I will say is this was a lot of work for this actual caramel frosting, and I don't recommend doing that even if you were to be able to do it the correct way. I just don't think it's worth it. I'm gonna link a video for Stovetop Kisses. She actually made a caramel cake as well, but instead of making the caramel yourself kind of thing that we did here today, she used sweetened condensed milk cans and put them in a slow cooker. So I'm going to link her video in the description box so you guys can check that out, because I think that's a much easier method and way more foolproof, because this is definitely not foolproof. I'm not a beginner when it comes to cooking, and I found this to be super hard, super time consuming, and just a lot. So I don't recommend making this way. Definitely make the cake. The cake is delicious just as it is, but the actual caramel, no. Don't even, unless you know what you're doing, I wouldn't recommend it. I went ahead and got my cake plate, and then I put a little bit of the caramel frosting onto the bottom of the cake plate just so that the cake wouldn't slide around. And then I added the first layer of the cake onto the cake plate and started to put the caramel on top. And as you can see, it's still a little bit runny, but I thought that it would still work because it seemed to be kind of standing up on the spoon. So I went ahead and added it to the first layer, spread it out, and noticed that it just started sliding off. So I was like, okay, well, let me go outside where it's cold and give this frosting a chance to set up and get thicker and all that, because clearly this is not working. So I gave it another maybe 15 minutes, and I just stood outside and kept beating it with a spoon to see if it would thicken up even more. And then I came back in the house and tried to do the second layer. So here we go, adding the second layer with the second layer of frosting. Actually had to clean up the cake plate because it was a mess. It had caramel everywhere. It was just a whole project, y'all. I do not recommend this. And that's why I'm giving you an alternative to making this frosting. But the cake itself is good. So if you want to make the cake, make the cake. But the frosting part of it, that's up to you. So I let the frosting cool for about 30 minutes. And then I went ahead and iced the cake because I was like, forget it. It is what it is at this point. I actually finished icing the cake. It was sliding. The cake layers were sliding all over the place. I had to keep repositioning them. The actual frosting would not stay on the cake. And that's what you see here, me just trying to show you guys that it is just slipping and sliding everywhere. Like, this was a whole thing. Like, it was a mess. I decided to just leave it alone and see how the cake tasted on the inside. So I went ahead and cut a slice so you guys could see what it looks like, and it looks really good on the inside, and it actually tastes really good. The cake is super moist. The actual frosting itself tastes good. It's just that the texture is not thick enough for this application. But what I will say is I took the leftovers from the frosting, from the caramel frosting, and we used it as a dip for apples, and it works great for that. So I don't know why it's not thick enough for putting it on a cake, but if you want to use it for something else, if you do decide to make this. Also, this was a double batch of the frosting, which I thought would be enough, but this frosting is so sweet. I don't think you need to make a double batch of it if you're going to make it. That was what the recipe suggested, so I did it that way, but I ended up with a lot of extra leftover frostings. So that is it for this recipe. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you decide to make this cake, let me know what you think about it in the comments. And also check out Stovetop Kisses video so that you can learn a new way to make frosting so that you don't have to struggle through making this one. So if you like the video, give it a thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe to my channel if you're new, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.